It's great to be here at this fabulous place for this wonderful event and to see such a great turnout. Gianna asked me to speak a little bit about poetry and jazz. As she mentioned, my own connection goes way back around 1969 or 70. I was only about 3 years old at the time. I had really just begun writing poetry at that time, and I was a graduate student at Washington University, and I actually, by chance, attended an event. I actually heard about it at the last minute by this saxophone player named James Marshall, who in Brown Hall was doing a very powerful apocalyptic poem, accompanying himself in between apocalyptic passages on the saxophone, and it really blew me away. I had to get to know this guy. So we met and we became friends, and I started going over to his house and hanging out. And there were always other musicians over there, and several of them were alumni of the Black Artists Group, which is really a seminal group for not only jazz, but poetry and jazz in St. Louis. And they would always be playing over there. So rather than just sit in somebody's living room listening to a jazz group, I had to do something. So I started jamming some of my poetry with this group. And that evolved into a group called the Human Arts Ensemble, which performed throughout the 70s and much of the 80s. Poets associated with jazz with Bag were Shirley LaFleur, Ajule Rutland, who was also a drummer, and Bob Malenke Elliott. In the 90s, I collaborated with a group called Harmony that included the poets Shirley LaFleur, Eugene Redman, and Kay Curtis Lyle. And usually we had a percussionist and a saxophone player. Our players included J.D. Parent and Maurice Malik King, who were the saxophone players who worked with Glenn Wright, Papa Wright, and Gary Sykes, who I still perform with today, was part of Harmony. And I've continued on and off to perform with an assortment of musicians. I've had the amazing experience of performing with musicians in Hungary, where I've been working with Hungarian poet friend translating Hungarian poetry. When I first started, I thought, oh, this is really hip, really avant-garde. But around that same period, I started reading a book by the poet Jerome Rothenberg, an anthology called Technicians of the Sacred, which looked at pre-literate poetries, usually by tribal groups that had been translated mostly by anthropologists and some by poets. And he would have thorough notes in which he would explain the contexts of the poems, which usually were multimedia. They involved dance, they involved music. So I realized I'm really getting at really the roots of poetry here with this kind of, it's nothing new, it's one of those old, new kinds of things. And its roots in America precede Bag, really. The Beats revived it. You can hear Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Kenneth Rexroth on albums from the Cellar in San Francisco. Prior to that, Langston Hughes was recording poetry and music, and his inspiration was a poet from Springfield, Illinois, Rachel Lindsay, who regarded Hughes as his poetic son, as he called it. They actually met when in Baltimore, Rachel Lindsay was doing a performance. He would do theatrical performances of his poems, accompanying himself on a tom-tom and chanting poems like the Congo. But Hughes was working as a busboy in a restaurant, and he gave this famous poet of the day his poems, a sheaf of his poems, and got a lot of encouragement from Lindsay, which kind of launched him on his way. So, as far as publications go, one of my earliest and favorite publications was in a magazine called Bright Moments, which had a photograph of Roland Kirk blowing 2 saxophones on the cover, and had great writers in it. I was in an issue with Jack Kerouac, with Amiri Baraka, and I had another connection with those writers. The aforementioned Man Who Looked Into Coltrane's Horn was published as a letterpress book in a Caliban Press jazz series, which was the 3rd in a series which included a work by Kerouac on Charlie Parker, a work by Baraka on Miles Davis, and my poem on Coltrane. More recently, I've had a chance to work with some of our great musicians in St. Louis, including Henry Claude and Tracy Andriotti. There she is. So we're going to do a couple of few pieces for you. The first one